I wonder who can recall the last message that Mark brought to us from the story of the Exodus. It was a few weeks ago, it was the middle of the summer holiday, and I'm almost positive the weather wasn't quite this good because the children are off school, and the weather is never that good when they are off school. But he brought us up to speed on the movement of the Israelites, that journey that they took across the Red Sea. How Moses had raised his staff and parted the waters and the people had passed through. And then that moment as they stood on the far shore and the waters came crashing back down on the Egyptians, and suddenly that pursuit of them was over. That worry that they had that they were being chased was finished. This morning I want to pick up from that point. It's very easy in the Exodus story to jump around. There's some great moments, but I think it's important that we journey with them, that we understand what's going on, because I think the story builds and builds and builds, and each moment actually is incredibly important. Even those that maybe we don't quite understand or don't see as relevant. As the people gathered on the far side of the Red Sea, we heard them singing a song of praise to God. Some of you would have recognized it. But Katie this morning brought us that song of praise from Miriam and from Moses. It's very difficult for us to picture it. But that song, even with the difficult words about the crushing of the Egyptians, burst forth from people who had spent their entire lives as slaves. What an incredible moment as the outpouring of praise is birthed from the reality of freedom. No longer forced to bake bricks. Free people. But the truth is this, like every great story, the truth of this moment is that it is just the beginning for the people. If it wasn't for the fact it was so hot, we were just going to watch Tolkien's reinterpretation of Walking for 3.5 hours, but I thought that was a bit much. Like all good stories, the beginning of the journey is often almost a bit dull. Lord of the Rings begins to get going once they encounter all of the challenges they face. But the truth is, this moment at the beginning of the Exodus story, despite all we have heard, is incredibly important. These next few days for the Israelites are crucial. The reason it's so important for me in this next few passages is because in these moments we begin to see that the Israelites are free from Egypt physically. But spiritually and mentally they are still very much held captive. There is so much more going on than just the freedom by the ability to move. These people are being held. And just like Frodo and the Fellowship of the Ring, they are about to begin a journey. And whilst they may not face the creatures that Tolkien created, they face a set of realities that are very similar to ours. Realities that many of us will be able to relate to. I adore this Exodus story, the burning bush, the Red Sea. But for me, some of the most important parts are found in that wilderness walking, as the people wander. I wonder if we were to stop this morning, how many of us would confess that we feel somewhat like we are in a wilderness. That our reality is that we feel a little bit detached, a little bit lost, a little bit like we are going round and round in circles. I wonder how many of us, if we were to look above just where we are and see the church, would conclude that the church, globally, probably nationally, maybe locally, would find itself somewhat in the wilderness, looking for its place in amongst society and how it can follow God truly. Consider for a moment where we have come from, a baby hidden in the bulrushes who would grow to be a murderer, who would then have an encounter with God at a burning bush, would then be a part of bringing plagues before taking people to freedom, who are then followed, a pillar of fire, crossing through the middle of a sea, and then that end to the Egyptians' pursuit. All of this builds to these people heading towards the promised land. All of these things play a part in building the story that these people are about to go through. But this journey isn't so much about the destination. We get very fixed on this promised land moment. But I believe we see throughout the journey an incredible encounter with God, a reality that for many of us we need to come to terms with. So I'm going to ask Mary to come for us this morning and just share from God's word. Thank you, Mary.
The reading comes from Exodus chapter 15, verses 22 to 27. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they travelled in the desert without finding water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water, because it was bitter. That is why the place is called Marah. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water.
Thank you, Mary. We've talked about it before, but I really want us just to hold on for a moment to that memory of who these people are. Who are the people that are referred to in this story? These are the people who have watched a plague of locusts, a people who have seen the Nile turned to blood, a people who have watched the waves part in the Red Sea and then walked through it on dry land. People who had that personal protection that we read about previously. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so neither went near one another all night long. This was the experience of the people. And then they grumbled. I mean, if ever the Bible wanted to depict me, it may be that moment where these people who had seen all of these things grumbled. They started to complain. They were about to undertake a walk far longer than that the Fellowship of the Ring would take. And yet we already encounter problems. So we're just going to walk through the verses that Mary read this morning, hopefully so that we can understand something of what was going on, and dare I say, maybe admit for some of us where we would find ourselves. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. I've shared with you before that I grew up on summer camps. It seems an appropriate time with this weather to mention summer camps. But I grew up on them. Every summer my parents would pack me off for a week, often to Bridgewater, to spend time in worship, in the Word, making friends, getting stuck up trees, and all the other things. And I would come back so fired up. My gosh, if you want to be fired up about God, get stuck in the middle of Bridgewater for a week with a bunch of other young people. And I would come back excited. Can you imagine how excited the Israelites would have been as they crossed that Red Sea after all they had seen, freedom from their pursuers? I would come back so excited from camp. And that first Sunday, I would sit on the front pew and I would sing my little heart out, and I'd go out with the kids, and I was probably a real pain to my leader because I felt like I knew everything. But as the weeks went on, I would have slowly moved back in the pews, inevitably retreating to the balcony, which is where I spent many of my Sunday mornings at church. I would say by mid-November, everything had faded. The summer was a distant memory, school had kicked in, and I found myself so disconnected once again. 3 days after crossing the Red Sea on dry land, the people begin to grumble. After 3 days of seeing God at work in one of the most miraculous moments, the people start to face the reality of what life is about to look like. And in this case, it is that lack of water. They were thirsty. I wonder for us, what is that lack of water from Sunday to Sunday? What's that lack of water between encounter with God and encounter with God? I don't want to belittle encounters with God just to Sundays. They happen all the time. But what is it for us that consistently can get in the way? What is it that means we can encounter God in such a real way and yet find ourselves despondent, dismayed, disheartened, whatever it might be? Maybe I dare go as far as saying, what are those situations in our lives that leave us grumbling? Because it's a reality for all of us. It doesn't always feel like the safety of a chapel on a Sunday morning and music. Life is tough. Things get hard. So what is it that can leave you grumbling? Because don't forget, the people that we are talking about have seen some amazing things, and yet it takes them just 72 hours. 72 hours since they crossed the sea to begin to complain. I am very impatient, but I think I'd last slightly longer than 72 hours having crossed the Red Sea. So we have to ask ourselves, what is it within us that can leave us grumbling? What is there in our weeks that can distract us from who God is and dishearten us? We continue this journey with them. When they came to Marah, they could not drink its water because it was bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink? What are we to drink?" There is something incredibly powerful in this passage that I am baffled is hidden in amongst this story in the Old Testament. This, for me, is one of the most defining moments in the whole journey of the Exodus. Everything that has been and everything that is to come, I believe, is hidden within this passage. The people who have just come from crossing the Red Sea. They've seen God do amazing things. And yet we see in this passage that there is so much more to come than being freed from the chains of Egypt. You see, the people have woken up every day in Egypt to a routine. Every single day they would have awoken and they would have been set to work. There would have been slave drivers dictating what they were doing. When we read the story back, we see that there was a decision that no longer would the hay and straw be collected for them. They now needed to do that. They would have been told when they could break and when they could finish. Everything was dictated to the people. And they find themselves free from that hold, freed by God. But the problem was the mentality of being a slave would take generations to break. Verse 24, so the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" These people have just witnessed a pillar of fire and of smoke, protecting them in the wilderness, bringing them light and darkness to the Egyptians. They've then seen a man raise a staff and the waters of the Red Sea part, and then walk down the middle of it before the waters came crashing back down. And yet their first response in times of crises is to a man. These people, and dare I say we, are stuck with a mentality which is, I need to find someone, in this case to grumble to, someone to solve it for me. The people are about to take 40 years to understand that they have access to God. Their first response at their first dilemma is to Moses, not to God. These people are still enslaved by the mentality that somebody needs to do it for them. Somebody needs to tell them how to do it. Looking to man for answers. Please don't get me wrong. Leadership, discipleship, mentors, all of those things are amazing. Access them. Please use them as support. But please hear this. Right up into a carpenter's son, born in Bethlehem, walked the earth. There never was, and there has never been since, a human that should dictate your every step. Before Jesus, there was never a man that should dictate every step you take, and since, there has not been. The decisions we make, the way we live our lives should always be God's call on us. Moses was an incredible leader, does some amazing things, but he is not the answer. Only God is. And we see so early on that the people need to break that mentality of assuming on someone else. By all means, come to Mark or I, go to your friends, share in connect groups. But what would it look like if we do that once we've been to God? What would it look like to be a people whose first response is God in everything? Please hear me. Find support. Share. But we see here the mentality that we still hold on to is to people. So much so that this next passage is crucial, because when the people grumbled to Moses, Moses cried out to the Lord. This is the part of his leadership they needed to learn. To be a people who cry out to God. Not to undermine Moses, not to do any of that, but to understand Moses was God's mouthpiece. Moses was God's chosen leader for this time, but he was not God. Praise the Lord, neither am I. And neither's Mark, and neither any of the people that you may choose to do life with. They are good people, I am sure, but they are not God. Moses' first response is to cry out to the Lord. The problem is, and we won't rush ahead too far, Moses is just a man. And even he makes mistakes. There will be a time upon which he no longer responds by crying out to God as his first moment. You say it may not be as easy to come before God, especially when we want to grumble. Sometimes that lamenting, sometimes that reality of the hardship we face seems inappropriate to bring to God, but it's good to have a coffee with a friend and have a whinge. What would it look like if we were a people who came to God first with everything, with our praise, with our frustrations, with our challenges? How much more powerful would it be when you sit down with that friend and say, I just need to talk to you about something, and they say, you know what, God's spoken to me about this. God's in this already. God's in this already. I shared this with Mark. It's not in my notes. But I shared this with Mark this week. I feel incredibly challenged. When Mark and I do pastoral visits, and I'm sure it's the same for many pastors, we sit down, we often accept or reject tea and coffee based on your quality of caffeine. And then we listen to what's wrong. And we spend time with you, and we love it. And then at the end of our time with you, we say, we'd love to pray with you. I am deeply challenged why I don't pray at the beginning. Why is my first port of call when I spend time with you not to say, let's just spend some time with God, because this is about him. Without him, I am useless. Without him, I'm going to refer you to my dad for DIY and to some theologian for deeper thinking. I think I find myself guilty at times of falling into that trap that I am standing in the gap, which is good, please hear me. But it has to be about God. This whole journey for the next 40 years is about them understanding who their God is. Not someone else's God, their God, individually, personally, intimately. The passage continues, then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became fit to drink. This is not a pillar of fire, and it's not a plague. God showed Moses a piece of wood. It wasn't anointed. It doesn't appear to be any particular special piece of wood. God simply shows Moses a piece of wood lying on the floor, to which Moses picks up this piece of wood that is just lying on the floor, throws it into undrinkable water, and when this unamazing piece of wood hits the water, it becomes drinkable. A God who parted the Red Sea, a God who brought plagues, a God who made a bush burn without burning up. My gosh, the God of all creation uses a humble piece of wood lying on the floor to answer the prayers and the cries of the people. The most simple of things, overlooked, walked past, trodden on, disregarded because it's no longer part of the tree it once was a part of. And God chooses to use this. And the water becomes fit to drink. The natural response of the people of that time, maybe less so the Israelites after their experience in Egypt, but generally was to worship the thing that fixed the problem. So the natural response is to worship the wood. The natural response is to worship the wood. We would, if we took time in history to read that the reason that people worshiped the sun was because they began to understand the only way their crops grew was because of the sun. So they worshiped the sun. And then they realized they needed water. So they began to worship the water. The people's first response was to worship the thing that fixed the problem, not the God who created the thing. So maybe in our generation we wouldn't necessarily worship the thing, although I would probably suggest if we looked at our habits, there may be things we do that have become a focus of our worship. If we don't worship the thing, the next reaction will be to worship the one who was involved in doing what God did. So we begin to worship man, looking to those leaders who can guide us, beginning to throw all of our weight behind what they are doing. But this whole journey, and I will say it time and time again, is about God revealing to the people that it is he who they should worship. This is God adjusting an entire mentality of a people. A God teaching them not to worship man or creation, but him. In fact, he will go on to say incredibly explicitly, "Thou shalt have no other gods before me." It's what God's doing. He is taking the people on a journey to understand that. Please hear me, it is not even implied that the people worship anything other than God at this point. But without rushing ahead of ourselves, we see that this mentality does need to be broken. And they are guilty of finding other things to worship before God. God knows this. God is at work in their lives. God is on the journey with them. And we see that because after this moment, we read this. There the Lord issued a ruling and instructed for them to put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians, for I am the Lord who heals you." Those of you who joined us on Tuesday for Connecting Together would have heard a very similar highlight that I made in the Great Commission. If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, God wants a people who follow him. God wants a people who fix their eyes upon him, who listen to his words. God is stood there saying, even in this passage, "See all I am capable of, everything I have done before you, everything you have heard the stories of from generation to generation. I will withhold all of that reality from you if you put me first, if you focus your eyes upon me." This passage lays that foundation for much of the experience of the Israelites in the wilderness. God bringing them from this worldly view, this worldly understanding, to this reality of their God, personal, intimate, and with them. Moving from this model of being stuck in a place to the model of freedom. A model of needing somebody to tell them everything they can do, to coming under his authority. If ever there was something worth saying from the front of the chapel, it has to be from this: fix your eyes on God. Fix your eyes on God. If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, fix your eyes on God. This God who can use a random bit of wood on the floor to cleanse an entire pool of water so that the people can drink. Fix your eyes upon him. This God who is present with them, who is not demanding a production line of bricks. They are called to fix their eyes upon him. In fact, the Bible will go forward from this point and has done so before, highlighting that all God asks is for his people to be present. With their eyes fixed upon him, wholly, all of who we are present with him and following him. That's the call on our lives. These people are 3 days in. They are 3 days into what is about to become a 40-year journey on how to follow God. My prayer all this week and ongoingly is that I will pick it up quicker than they did. My prayer for us as a church is we pick it up quicker than they did. So I ask you again, what is your thirst? What is it that draws you to that point of grumble? Bring it before God. Maybe looking at your life, what is it that you can take from a gracious God to be your piece of wood this week? What do we see every day and maybe forget his goodness? You see, this whole story, in fact, everything we do has to be more than just about a Sunday. It has to be more than just this service, because the truth was, freeing the people from Egypt was far more than just freeing them. It didn't end with the freedom. It ended as the journey, it didn't even end. As the journey went on, the people began to understand. There was no single moment that would define them. It wasn't just about these miracles that God had done. It was about understanding he was their God. Generations later, he would say it in a different way with Jesus. But in this moment, he tells them to fix their eyes upon him, to follow his ways, to break free from the chains of Egypt.